the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guests, we just want to mention we've got a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Times are hard. If you can, throw us $1 a month. If not, it would be great if you could leave us a nice review on iTunes in lieu of that. But today, Taylor and I will be bringing you all a conversation with Samo Tomsic. Samo holds a PhD in philosophy and is currently interim professor of philosophy at the University of Fine Arts Hamburg, as well as researcher at the Interdisciplinary Laboratory Matters of Activity at the Humboldt University Berlin. His research areas comprise contemporary European philosophy, structuralism, poststructuralism, psychoanalysis, epistemology, and political philosophy. Some of his most recent works are The Capitalist Unconscious, published in 2015, and The Labor of Enjoyment, 2018, which will be the focus of our discussion today. Before we get started, just a real quick shout out to Sigmund Freud.
I will say two things. One, Cooper has enjoyed, again, a problematic term. He's enjoyed reading Freud more and more that we talk about him. And two, just to make sure that I understand this, and Coop, you can cut this out or you can chastise me. Is it pronounced Tomsic? Is that how you pronounce it? Or
that's exactly how you pronounce it.
Okay. We want to get that right. I know that, we're, this is why it's important to have the diacritics, Coop, in the documents.
Thank you for having me here today. It's really, really great pleasure.
As we were mentioning in the kind of warm-up notes, Taylor mentioned we just looked at Freud's 3 essays, but before that, the week before that, we actually wrapped up our journey through Anti-Oedipus, chapter 4. Those 2 weeks back to back before talking to you were like we're perfectly ready for this conversation. I think libidinal economics is definitely fresh in our minds, so we're very excited to dive into your work today.
I guess it's serendipity too, because since I had to reschedule, when we had to reschedule everything, you were supposed to come on before those two, and it kind of worked out. I think better that we got to go through those and then have you on. So I do want to apologize first of all for making you reschedule, and thank you for being generous with your time. And we're so happy to have you on today.
No worries. I mean, it's also, as you said, retrospectively, it's better that we rescheduled.
It's the destiny of the drive. So
now we need to call our God Logos, as Freud would put it.
I do want to give you the chance, Sarah, to just maybe tell us a little bit about any memories or thoughts or stories you have about how you maybe fell into this investigative theoretical aspect, whether it be into psychoanalysis or philosophy in general, the humanities. Do you have anything to share concerning like your origin story so we can better understand what made you the writer and thinker you are today?
The origin story. So you want me to invent a myth?
Yes, please. Exactly. That's right.
Fill in the gaps.
It's a heavy task. No, but I started studying philosophy in the late 90s in Ljubljana. So basically, I grew up in a very provincial, very deindustrialized, poor region in Slovenia, in the north, bordering Austria. Yeah, how to put it? I mean, I guess, and this is where the myth comes in. There's this kind of experience of rural alienation,
right,
rather than rural rootedness, as Heidegger would put it. So I had the exact opposite experience. But maybe, since Heidegger was living in the Black Forest region, which is fairly well economically situated compared to where I grew up in, or maybe it was just too close to the mountains. In German, you have this word that Heidegger uses entbergen and verbergen of being, unveiling and hiding, or revealing and hiding.
Right.
This ontological Ford-Da game of being. It contains berg. It contains the same root as the word for mountains.
Okay,
Berg.
right.
So, we could also think about that entbergen and verbergen is just like, Heidegger observing the Alps, how they, are being hidden by the clouds, and then they emerge when the sky clears and so on and so forth. But joke aside, I basically always wanted to run away from the place where I grew up in. Well, always, since my consciousness can recall. There's no Oedipal background here. I have very nice, very close relation, very good relation with my parents. So there was no parental antagonism or whatever. It was just a place I never saw myself in. I felt dislocated, and I think this dislocation, is also in a way something that defines philosophy since the very beginnings, and something that continues to define it in the present. And I kind of, when I hit puberty, I I kind of come up with the idea that studying philosophy is the thing to do. I had no idea about Lacan at that point. That happened when I started studying. I actually didn't mention Heidegger by chance, because that was my first philosophical passion. I've read Nietzsche before, but I guess every adolescent reads Nietzsche if they're interested in philosophy. So somehow it's the rebels, whatever, excess. But it was actually Heidegger that was the first philosopher that really interested me. And then this name Lacan constantly popped up,
Right.
in conversations with other students, and I was at some point, okay, I have to have a look at this. And so I bought the Slovenian translation of the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis.
Nice.
And I still remember the outrage, the irritation, when I started reading this, and I was like, I don't understand the bloody thing about this. Why is everyone so into it? And everyone, not really everyone, but why is this proper name so invested with whatever aura? So then I quickly figured out that if you want to understand this gibberish, you have to read something else.
Right.
Freud for starts, so Sür, Jakobson, Levi-Strauss. So I got increasingly entangled in this
signifying chain, just like wrapping itself around your neck.
What always found very interesting in Lacan is that he's basically a system of connections, basically this is something that very, very much attracted me in his opaqueness. Freud is as well, but Freud is a very clear and
he's clear.
modest thinker.
Correct. Yeah. Right.
Oh yeah. Continue if you feel like it, but we can.
I think
the
origin has been invented.
Gotcha. Part of this is so interesting that you would go from one of your first passions, as you call it, from Heidegger to Lacan, and it's Lacan is the one that's clear and not clear. I find it interesting to think of how many times trying to slog through Being and Time and thinking like I'm not sure. Although for me it's always Hegel. That's that recipe for wondering what is going on and wanting to throw a book is Hegel and Lacan. And I would say, just to add, I'm curious about your reflection. One of the things that your friend Alenka Zupancic said was there was in Ljubljana, there was something, spirit of the time. There was something in the air, so to speak, of this conjunction of psychoanalysis and philosophy. Do you feel that's part of what you were referring to with Lacan's name being circulated in class?
Absolutely. I think this was kind of the constant background, that also determined a certain standard of doing philosophy in Slovenia, even though, of course, I must add that the department where I studied, so in Ljubljana, at the University of Ljubljana, was Lacanians were very marginal.
Okay.
a very marginal group. I mean, Mladen Dolar was still teaching at that point. Then my future supervisor, Jelica Šumić, and her husband, Rado Riha, were visiting visiting lectures or visiting professors for ethics at the department, but they had to be re-invited every year. So at some point, the department cut them off.
Okay.
And they were working primarily at the Institute of Philosophy at the Scientific Research Center, where Alenka is also working. That was pretty much it, from the Lacanian camp. Analytic philosophy was very strong, but it wasn't the only fortress there. I mean, the Heideggerian camp was also quite strong, but that's something that very quickly also drew me away from Heideggerianism, because all Heideggerians in Slovenia are, well, what one would expect from a consequent Heideggerian to be, right-wing.
Gotcha. Yeah.
This kind of blood and soil ideology and so on and so forth, and this discourse on authenticity, rootedness, and blah, blah, blah. So they actually were involved also in the independence movement in the 80s. They were the true, like this kind of schoolbook type of dissidents. And they were also sort of involved in writing the Constitution, or at least, there was writers in the Constitution at some point, and then some of them were also involved in the first government and the first attempts or the first steps, legal steps towards independence. But yeah, they're all peculiar brand of nationalists.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Whereas Lacanians were always very consistently left, and that was pretty much the first thing that you got communicated as a student. Okay, this is, if you want to, do left wing philosophy, this is where you're heading. They were not indoctrinating, in quotation marks. It was not that you had to do Lacan in order to be, part of the part of this gang, or whatever you want to call it. They were actually introducing contemporary thinkers or contemporary philosophers into Slovenian context. So they would be, they would make sure that, they made the first translations of Lyotard, of Badiou, of Rancière, and so on and so forth. So they were actually translating and commenting and teaching the entire system of so-called French theory or contemporary French. Of course, Lacan was kind of the main common denominator for all of them, but they were actually, opening a much broader field for us students.
I think that's great to add that context. And before sort of diving into the book, because there's plenty to talk about, I'll already anticipate and think about, one of your opening chapters where, not to paraphrase everything, but you bring in a kind of interesting look at Aristotle, which will keep with us through the book. And just to, in my head, the way I paraphrase it is Aristotle's has a kind of, for him, this height of philosophy culminates in a kind of logic where there is a stability in language and it's anchored in, say, God, maybe what Heidegger might call ontotheology. And it's interesting now thinking about it, you don't really discuss Heidegger. Do you think that first love, do you think Heidegger skirts the line between Aristotle and someone like Lacan, who might be more of a sophist in Aristotle's language, where there is this instability in, whether it be language, the symbolic, the bodily borders of the drive? Is Heidegger still more of an Aristotelian in this sense, in participating in this ideal of, say, being and speaking, or is there kind of a slippage too that would lead you to someone like Freud, Lacan, who is going to destabilize this homeostasis that you describe?
I think Heidegger definitely is a discontinuity. I can only refer to Barbara Cassin's work on this whole issue of the language of being, which was very formative for me as well. And Heidegger is an Aristotelian in quotation marks in the sense that he still has this central idea of a privileged language of being, language in which being itself comes to speak. This is also why. I mean, I kind of like, this very banal sounding, but still interesting remark, the language speaks, the words or whatever. I mean, one could do
nothings
out of Heidegger, of course, but die Sprache spricht in German, it's very clear, that it's a repetition on a tautology, that is involved in this Heideggerian remark. But, language speaks. So he kind of, focuses on the autonomy of language. Whereas in Aristotle, of course, there is no autonomy of language, because language is considered as an organ and a tool. It's considered pragmatic through the lenses of pragmatics. Of course, and here Barbara Cassin comes in. I very much like her critique of Aristotelianism as this kind of forceful normalization, disciplining of language, disciplining of speaking, that there is something like, a decision at the beginning of Aristotle's philosophy, a decision that we do not find at the beginning of Plato's philosophy. Because Plato is way more ambiguous when it comes to the figure of the sophist, and when it comes to also, his philosophy of language is still kind of pre-epistemological, because it contains a lot of myth. If we take his dialogue Cratylus, where he has this speculation about the origin of words and the origin of sounds, or linguistic sounds and letters of the Greek alphabet, and he has this idea that they are basically imitating natural qualities. So there is this kind of mythical continuum between the qualities of matter or physics and linguistics. The signifier, is basically an imitation of natural sounds. It's a crazy idea, and Lacan says in Encore that this is a completely hopeless theory. It has something excessive, because he's basically also speaking about the language of being, or the language of physis, the language of nature, the language of physicality, or the language of matter. It has something very disorienting, alienating even, specifically for Aristotelianism and for the Aristotelian normativism. It has something extremely alienating at it. Whereas, for Aristotle, logics is supposed to order thinking. It's a grammar of thought, and it's also, in a way, a grammar of being, And here again, Barbara Cassin with her thesis, that at the beginning there has to be a decision, comes in that basically this decision is a gesture of the master, a gesture of the master ontologist, as Lacan would also put it. That's Aristotle. I guess Heidegger is, making the opposite decision. He decides for poetic language as the privileged language of being, or which being unveils itself. But at the same time, I mean, there's still this centrality of the sense of being, the senseful rather than senseless character of being. I mean, I always thought that Lacan's critique of philosophy and of ontology in particular, as a ground discipline of classical philosophy, this critique that being is an effect of discourse, which kind of resonates with this entire theory of linguistic performativity and so on and so forth, is not to be taken, in this naive, superficial sense that, yes, language kind of with its activity creates this effect that is the effect of being, or the effect of existence, or the effect of presence, but that what philosophy overlooks is not that being is the effect of language. This is something that Heidegger said, in a way, but that being is the enjoyment that is specific for philosophy. So that the philosophical name for enjoyment that is generated through discourse, in and through discourse, is being. And that ultimately we can understand a specific form of philosophy that is Aristotelianism, but also, Heideggerianism, as a way of mystifying the true materiality of linguistic product or discursive production, and also mystifying that philosophy, in a way, always ends up being involved or producing some sort of exploitative, dominating relation with regard to what is. It's never about, describing what is, but as Aristotle says, it's not to on, but toti en einai, what has to be. This is also, one thing that Lacan, again in Encore, draws attention to, that basically Aristotle's main interest is to determine how things got to be in terms of imperative, in terms of duty. You have to be like this and that. This is where this entire equation of philosophy with the master's discourse then follows. And I mean, this is also one huge complicated topic, because of course the master's discourse is a discourse of domination, but I think we shouldn't be seduced by this term master too much, because I think Lacan is aiming also at a very basic feature of language when he uses this term, which concerns, just establishing some sort of connectivity and consistency and bond or network of signifiers, to put it a bit abstract, so that there is something that holds together. But of course, I mean, as it's always the case with Lacan, he also kind of tries to draw our attention to the fact that producing such consistent linguistic consistency or symbolic consistencies always remains open to the risk of establishing a regime of domination, of mastery, in the very literal sense of the word.
There's so many places we could go there, but I really like that you brought up the master's discourse there and related it to philosophy, because I do think that there is perhaps this oscillation between philosophy being either sort of reinvigorating the master's discourse, or sometimes falling into, with like analytic philosophy, into the university discourse, and perhaps falling behind, knowledge as the objective regime that can then, under the scene, hide power. But I instead of necessarily going through that, because I think this is a good way to open up into your book, I wanted to merely say one thing that was almost an afterthought or an aside, but that's always some of the most interesting parts of a book and of a chain of thinking. And then we can look at some of the notes that Coop has and keep us going. One of the things, because we were talking about Aristotle, was you offhand mentioned that to a certain extent, Stalin was an extreme Aristotelian. And this was something that really made me, I'll say I enjoyed it, right? Just again, on what we're talking about. But what was interesting was how you were describing the difference between Plato and Aristotle, and how there's something alienating for an Aristotelian. And this might come as, I think, counterintuitive to someone who hasn't read your book. But I think that's the kernel of truth there, is precisely in this idea that Stalin was an extreme Aristotelian insofar as Stalinism participated in this fantasy, if you will, of de-alienating, or of the imperative of disalienating individuals and the society in which the Soviet bloc existed. And I just wanted to I don't really have a question there, but do you want to say a word about, because some of the most powerful passages in the middle of your book is concerning this question of what happens to alienation in, whether it be, actually existing communism, say in the future, or in the totalitarian regime that I was just describing, and how that's part of this, I can call it a fantasy. I can't think of maybe ideology, but just anything that you feel like responding to there, if that gave you something to, maybe just what you think you meant by the extreme Aristotelianism of Stalin.
I mean, that's more linked to his intervention in the linguistic debates in Soviet Union in the late 40s.
Gotcha.
think, or around 1950, so shortly before his death. And, the problem of Marxism, the idea of language being a superstructure, that would then imply if language is a superstructure, this means that a communist revolution has to invent a new language. And of course, it didn't. And also, this was an intervention that also Lacan then kind of referred to in, I think, his the instance of the letter writing, and also in the seminar, mentioning Stalin always with a pinch of irony. That at some point Stalin had to intervene in this linguistic mess or this polemics by ordering that language was not a superstructure. Stalin basically doesn't say that language is the base either. So he has a very peculiar, interestingly careful position, even though the texts that he wrote for Pravda, which addressed him with this party newspaper, addressed him with these questions about Marxism and what he thinks about linguistic matters and so on and so forth. And ultimately, there's this assumption, probably well-grounded, that it was actually Bakhtin that wrote the text, and Stalin just gave the yes and no answers. I can imagine this. How you have to find the bureaucrat who will basically invent or provide the scientific grounding for Stalin's "niet und da." Is language a superstructure? Niet. Is language a base? Niet. It's and now deal with it. But, joke aside, if you look at these interventions that bear Stalin's name, so in the end, he did put his name under these developments, so it doesn't really matter whether it was ghostwritten or not. It is Stalin's official position, sanctioned, approved by Stalin. And it was also, kind of, again, a pragmatic stance, which was supposed to, also go in the direction of some sort of Soviet multilingualism and, kind of acknowledging the, national rights and the composition of the entire, the multi-nation character of Soviet Union. So it's again a different direction that maybe doesn't really respond to the question of Aristotelianism. But Aristotelianism in Stalin is it's just, maybe I use this as a sort of provocation that he was a radical. Aristotelianism, if you read this text, he has very Aristotelian views of language.
Right.
Language is a tool of communication, of expression of inner thoughts and feelings and needs and so on and so forth. So there's absolutely nothing interesting about Stalin's, in quotation mark, conception of language. But he does have some interesting, or the text, this intervention has some interesting points. And one is this entire neither base nor superstructure issue, which could be unfolded, unpacked, and brought into an interesting direction that doesn't interest Stalin. And the other one is this kind of criticism of grammar as being too abstract, too immaterial, which is also, a fair criticism, that grammar is something like a Euclidean geometry, for which Lacan said that it consists of pure ghosts. And what he was interested in is, a geometry that has a body. That's what he said when he was obsessing with Borromean knots and on and so forth. But, again, to go back to Stalin, sorry for jumping back and forth.
No, it's fine.
He doesn't really provide a proper materialist philosophy of language in this intervention, even though he criticizes grammar as abstract and, kind of distanced from the living materiality and plurality and flux, if you want, of actually existing natural languages. But at the same time, he does pursue a certain linguistic nationalism, if you like, or linguistic internationalism, but still under a very clear agenda of his own understanding of dialectical materialism, which is for Stalin a naturalism. It's again, there's absolutely nothing dialectical nor materialist in his understanding of dialectical materialism.
I think that's great. And I think it connects with where, as Coop has here, sort of this going into your book, this idea of repression as the foundation of politics. And I just want to maybe clarify why I brought up Stalin was insofar as you write how with the October Revolution and sort of Stalinism afterward, it's this criminalization of capitalistic alienation, which also entails a kind of criminalization of what Lacan might call castration, linguistic alienation, and how instead of this fantasy of doing away with alienation, which you point to as being merely a fantasy and being almost the fantasy par excellence of neoliberalism, et cetera, Marx and Freud instead mobilize alienation in order to work through, as you keep reiterating throughout the book, which I think is great that it's refrained, to work through sort of the, let's say, transformation on the social and subjective level through work, through labor, through working through. So I like this idea that in fact alienation, it seems like I think intuitively it seems like a merely negative, but it's by mobilizing that negativity of alienation that can allow for a motor, if you will, for working through.
Of course, and I think that some people don't buy into this homology between Marx and Freud at all. Some want to see it in a just kind of restricted in a restricted manner. And I guess I'm kind of among those who are running wild with it and can't stop seeing it. So this is just doesn't have to be bought. It's a very biased reading, and I think there are only biased readings in philosophy or in humanities. Once you encounter a thought that irritates or inspires you or whatever, you have to take a stance. So about Marx and Freud, I think their common objective is to, if we talk about libidinal economy, and how subjects are structured in this weird machinery that is the discourse of enjoyment. So libidinal economy, they provide us, the subjects of contemporary libidinal economy, a new object, which is change. That's for me the main point of encounter. Change away from this consuming, monstrous, antisocial system that's the capitalist mode of production. And working through the way Freud writes and thinks about it is precisely transformative labor, which is working precisely on my embeddedness, entanglement with or in the social structure which conditions my illness or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
So in a way, psychoanalysis does pursue a certain type of social change, in quotation mark, but of course not the same type of social change as Marx's mature project of critique of political economy and the internationalist horizon that he envisages in his notion of, or his conception of, communism and so on and so forth. There is, of course, a different type of sociality that is addressed, or sociality is addressed from a different angle, from the angle of already formed masses and other political structures like the state and so on and so forth. But it's still on this kind of very general, very abstract level. It is social change in the strong sense of the word social that is targeted, and social as distinct from antisocial, which is what we are dealing with in the present moment or in the history of capitalism. It's just a mode of production that organizes antisociality and enforces antisociality. Production for the sake of production, for instance. That's Marx's name for the antisocial core of capitalist organization of production and of labor. to come finally to this issue of alienation, I mean, it's also so much is already in words themselves, in German words, because German language has a much more diversified and precise vocabulary for what, it's commonly packed under this umbrella of alienation in English. And of course, in English, you also have different words for this. So estrangement, externalization, Veräußerung. And Veräußerung, it doesn't have this drama yet, of alienation, of, loss of the self, or, expropriation, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't have that. It actually describes a dynamic, an activity that defines human subjectivity. That's why I like, going back to Hegel and his, reflections on work and language, or the activity of speech in phenomenology of spirit, where he basically says these are the two main processes in which not only something inner gets externalized, like for instance, I have an idea and then I am finding the right words to express it, or I have an idea and then I find the right means to produce a product. It's actually in this activity, in this productive activity, the difference between the inner and the outer gets established.
Right.
Veräußerung means, of course, we can read it superficially by saying something inner gets externalized and then stands opposite to me as, alienated. But we can also say, in good old structuralist manner, the relation is primary, and the inner and the outer are produced through this relation, or more precisely through this activity. Because the point of structuralism is not only that it talks about some abstract, rigid relations, but precisely about unstable, active relations, active materiality. The symbolic is active matter in a way for structuralism. I think, this is why I'm kind of insisting, on not positive reading of alienation, but of, to use another key psychoanalytic or Freudian term, on the ambivalence of alienation, that you can't, as a subject of activities such as labor and language and so on, you never come to terms with these activities, which means that this kind of interplay between inner and outer, or this kind of interpenetration of externality through the interior and internality, or interior and exterior, never comes to an end. This is how language functions. This is how we subjectivize. I would even perhaps say that alienation means for me as much as subjectivation. And of course, there are subjectivations that are subjections. And this is where alienation turns into an exploitative condition. That's why I prefer to, kind of speak about capitalism as the most refined system for exploiting alienation, and of course also enforcing ever new forms of exploitable alienations.
Right.
But at the same time, there's nothing more exploitative than a regime that commands disalienation. This is where neoliberalism, that you referenced, also comes in. The idea of homo economicus, which is now ideologically dead since 2008 at the latest. It doesn't have any ideological efficiency. But, this is an example of this assumption of a non-alienated subjectivity, which, is kind of coinciding with this kind of individual greed and private interest, as Smith would call it. There's no split, there's no division, no negativity. It's just, we are greedy individuals involved in mutual seduction. That's something that I kind of like in Adam Smith's scenario, the famous, the brewer and the butcher. Why do we address them? Not to convince them to take our interests into account, but look at their benefits. So right. We are pushing the button of their own greed.
Yes.
To establish a social a social bond or a relation of exchange, which is pretty much the same in this case. I mean, we could see that how this functions in practice. I mean, one cannot ever fully actualize Homo economicus, and the point of this theory of human subjectivity was not to actualize it, but to, enforce it socially as a non-actualizable, non-realizable ideal, which generates precisely more alienation. And for certain, perhaps we could also say, makes alienation desirable. As a side note, I'm also kind of, sympathetic towards Deleuze and Guattari here, and I think they really need to be saved from all the accelerationist and other delusional misreadings, which basically claim that the anti-Oedipus is about, desiring more alienation, and that more alienation will kind of set us free or whatever. The point, neither is this their political point. At least I don't see it.
Right.
I don't know, maybe I didn't read anti-Oedipus and Mill-Plateau too precisely, but I never saw this in Deleuze and Guattari, a desire for more alienation. Nor I think one should or one could legitimately make such a reproach to Lacanian theory or to Lacan himself,
right,
or to Freud for that matter.
Right.
Alienation is the solution,
right,
the way out of capitalism. No, it's not. It's not. It's a way out of. It doesn't lead anywhere except to redefining relations of exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just one last sentence with regard to communist politics. Of course, it's about going against the capitalist forms of alienation, but one could also say that communism as a regime of, as the name says, a system of commons, a system mm-hmm. of the communal, of sociality, is also about a specific type of alienation, which for me would be precisely solidarity. I think we cannot be solidary, like really solidary with an emancipatory struggle or engage in an emancipatory struggle if we do not precisely embrace, to put it somewhat pathetically, some sort of shared negativity, mm-hmm. Negativity that we share with other political subjectivities and other identities or other historical identities and struggles for emancipation. There is no, how to put it, only alienation is a sincere form of solidarity, I would say. When a struggle really takes the ground from our feet.
I was thinking about the pun you made about, the delusional aspects of accelerationism, because we were thinking about Deleuze, and that made me chuckle. But I do think that what Coop has here connects with your line of thought that you were just bringing out, specifically with respect to exploitation and enjoyment, etc. And so I do want to give Coop a chance to maybe keep us going here.
I really like the way that you engage with the concept of the death drive in the book. Part of that, I think, is perhaps this counterplay or like these two sort of opposing forces on the subject, perhaps you might characterize it. So I'm thinking about, you talk about resistance and repression, and I'm thinking about how those they kind of keep the subject on the sort of orbital path of the drive. Does that kind of fit with what you were, with kind of your conception? Or I don't know if you maybe want to talk a little bit about repression and resistance, maybe just a quick gloss on those, and then maybe if my connection to the death drive makes sense.
I didn't quite get the jump to the death drive, if you can.
Sure. Well, I was just thinking about these twin, maybe I should just back up and have you just kind of gloss a little bit. I think in particular for me, I'm not very clear on what resistance is. That's kind of slipping my mind. Repression, I think I have a little bit better of an understanding, but maybe we could start there and then I could, pick up.
Yeah, well, resistance is quite an interesting Freudian concept and problem, really clinical and epistemological problem. And I think this is also where Freud gets most political when he talks about resistance against psychoanalysis, resistance against the new, and so on and so forth. Whereby, as a side remark, when I said that I think what Marx and Freud are trying to kind of spark in the subject is a desire for change. So change and the new, are two signifiers that are also quite kind of, they're fuzzy, they're opaque. Behind them is a very simple idea of a non-exploitative social bond or sociality. One could very easily say, oh yeah, but capitalism is also about change and the new and blah 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 all the time. But it's not really. The only change that counts in capitalism, and pun intended, is the quantitative increase of value and the interplay between the quantifiable and non-quantifiable side of surplus value, and this entire drive for more as object, the more as the object of the capital drive. This is basically what Lacan breaks Marx down to, in a way. Surplus value is more as object, the idea of an object that moves, that increases,
right,
that expands, that there's always more to it, never enough. But that's not change. This quantitative or quantifiable turn into change is no change at all. And the new is also, I don't think there's anything that ultimately capitalism never produced anything new. Precisely because it's always organizing everything that can be produced as a novelty, a new theory, a new technological innovation, a new idea of sociality, and so on and so forth, around this drive for more of the same, more of value, more as object, to repeat myself. So it's more like an abolition of novelty and of change rather than its affirmation. Just because everything changes around us doesn't mean in the end that the framework itself ever changes. The drive of capital remains fixated at its surplus object. And this is where resistance also comes in. Right. I think resistance in Freud means precisely the resilience, the perseverance, the reproduction of the existing organization of libidinal economy. In
right.
Case.
Compulsion, etc.
Yeah.
So compulsion would be one aspect,
right.
One aspect of this resistance. Yeah, that you basically have reproduction of the same conditions of enjoyment or conditions of production, if we talk about social production. And again, no novelty, no change. Every potentially subversive innovation gets immediately neutralized in its transformative potential. This is kind of the mature Freud, where resistance has absolutely nothing to do with this kind of, heroic, organized resistance against the system.
It's like resistance to change, perhaps. Would that be a good way to characterize it?
Exactly.
So
Freud says it very explicitly. I think in his writing on resistance against psychoanalysis, where he talks about how he's being rejected by medicine because psychoanalysis is too speculative. It's getting rejected by philosophers because it's too clinical or whatever, So it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in anywhere. And then he talks about other forms of resistance. So we have three main expressions of resistance, I guess. The epistemic resistance. So when knowledge and our understanding of scientificity or of true knowledge is basically too rigid, too constraining to allow something like a plurality of the forms of knowledge. For instance, the vulgar empiricism or vulgar positivism is a form of, an a priori resistance. This resistance has been there before Freud invented psychoanalysis. So, so basically, it's something that underpins and sustains the hegemonic regime of knowledge and this kind of successful integration of psychoanalysis into capitalist productivity. It's conformism with production of surplus value.
Right.
An imperative to produce, in the last instance, something that counts as surplus value. Then there would be social resistance, of course, like forms of social conservatism, religion, and so on and so forth. Also, certain conservatism in philosophy, when it comes, to the understanding of consciousness, for instance, or the structure of human subjectivity as, centralized around the conscious instance and so forth. So the unconscious has absolutely no space here, and also not this Freudian idea that subjectivity is damaged, that subjectivity results from a certain constitutive trauma or damage or accident and suffering. And then, of course, libidinal.
Libidinal, yeah.
The libidinal aspect, or affective, if you want. But again, that's mature Freud. It's interesting, though, that Freud began, like in his, still 1890s work, he talked about neuropsychosis of defense. We kind of have this other idea of illness, again in quotation marks, because psychoanalysis doesn't have a normative idea of health, as a way of resisting the social, economic, libidinal structure that organizes my life, my existence in a consuming manner that causes suffering, that causes unease, discontent, anxiety, and so on and so forth. In a way, there's this kind of, again, ambivalence of the concept itself. The interesting and also the irritating part of Freud is that you never get a clear answer, or you never get a univocal answer. This is good, this is bad. It's always kind of this fluctuation between two oppositions, and it's the same with the drive. Freud kind of introduced the drive in a way in his writing, Drives and Their Vicissitudes, in a way that that really successfully leaves undistinguished what later became Eros and the death drive. You can see that the drive is a force that is somehow indifferent towards, my striving for self-preservation and, happiness, or whatever you want to call it. It goes against all the established ethical or moral philosophical ideals, and especially this myth that all humans pursue happiness. The happiness of the drive is in strong contradiction with my fuzzy ideas about what will bring happiness into my life. But later, he kind of breaks, as it's a familiar story. So he breaks the drive into two opposing forces, and that's the result of failing to work with this kind of ambivalence of emotional life, as one would put it, or as some would put it. The fact that the drive actually is a force, pursuing a satisfaction, but a satisfaction that can have destructive consequences for me as the one who has to carry it, schlep it along the line. So to finally come to the death drive is the ultimate expression. This is also something that Freud says in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, when he goes through all the forms of resistance against psychoanalysis. The ultimate resistance to psychoanalysis is the death drive. And why? Because it's, I guess Freud would say, it's because it wants to, kind of reestablish this state this ultimate state of homeostasis, which is death. At the same time, if drive is a constant force, the deadly, and I think one should take the expression Tod, death, in Todestrieb, death drive, seriously. It's not simply some excess of life or whatever. It is death. It's death as a consequence of the drive's striving for a satisfaction that takes no account of my well-being, the deadly autonomy of the drive. This is where also, I guess, this idea that the death drive is the ultimate expression of resistance comes in. we could, link this with Lacan's claim that every drive is virtually a death drive. I think it pretty much addresses the same issue, that every drive is, in a way, an expression of resistance against change, but at the same time, it can also be bent. That's the point of analysis and the impossible task of analysis, to bend the unbendable, or the unbendable. One of the interesting paradoxes of the drive is that, of course, they are constantly fixated, and when they are fixated, this is why they exercise resistance to loosening the ties with the libidinally invested objects. But at the same time, Freud also says that drives can change objects. Like there is no overdetermination what will fixate the drive. So, yeah. And also, there are different vicissitudes or destinies of the drive, which, well, some are more fortunate, some are less fortunate. Definitely a less fortunate one is repression. A more fortunate one would be sublimation. Because sublimation is, I think, where Freud kind of also envisages something like working with the drive, embedding the drive in a certain order or ordering organization that sustains rather than consumes my existence, or that sustains the formation of social relations rather than their dismantling, like in our contemporary capitalism.
Yeah, like lifting repression alone is not the solution, I guess.
Well, but
that kind of fits with what you're saying.
Yeah, but lifting repression doesn't mean for Freud being in a repressionless state. It means being in a different vicissitude of or destiny of the drive. And the question is, which one is it? I mean, I think repression and sublimation relate to each other as two sort of opposite, or two alternatives, maybe not as a plus and minus, or good repression, right. I mean bad repression, good sublimation, but I think they do relate as competitors, in a way. Okay. And then of course you have other, this kind of inversion from active to passive, and the turning upon and against one's own person, which would be, for instance, narcissism. But narcissism, not in this naive sense of, I'm in love with myself or whatever, but precisely the drive is killing me. That's narcissism. If one would have to pack narcissism in one sentence, I think this would be it. The drive is killing me.
I like that. That's good.
So, I mean, in German, it's Wendung gegen die eigene Person. And gegen means here both upon or toward and against.
Right. Okay.
So, it's like kind of
like an amulet you wear against a hex or something like that.
Sorry? Yeah, it's like strangling, or
right. I will just add, just really quickly to this conversation, this notion of resistance is also a resistance to working through, right? It's a resistance to working through the transformations of, whether it be of subjective transformation or literally the transformations of the drive implied in the changing of destinies and the vicissitudes. And so like the resistances to working through, whether it be in an analysis or, whether we think of it socially, libidinally, epistemically. And so I think that in that sense, working through is a good way in which you describe it as, instead of being content with the compulsive fixation of the drives on an object, to change. It's not enough merely to propose changing objects, but to effectuate taking change as the object. When change becomes the object, then there is a way in which working through is able to overcome the inertias and resistances, and, if you will, allow for transformation to sort of become the object. I thought that was an interesting way that was one of your refrains, not just of working through, but change as object.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But at the same time, you can really see that, Freud is not resisting resistance. He basically plays with it. He embraces it.
Right.
He works with resistance. Working through resistance ultimately. You know? And it's also a working with. That's also the point of transference, and the function of transference in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis begins, if we look at the early writings by Freud, where he's also criticizing his mentor and collaborator Joseph Breuer and the failed treatment of Bertha Pappenheim or Anna O. Mm-hmm. It's basically, he ran away from transference. When she produced the symptom of phantomic pregnancy, he basically got, it was too much. It was, one could say, that he felt harassed.
He couldn't deal with countertransference, if you will.
Yeah,
right?
well, but it was an escape. It was an escape out of analysis. Well, out of analysis that was not yet psychoanalysis, but escape out of treatment. Rebecca Kumei has a really well pointed essay on this. Resistance and repetition, relation in Freud, and the function, the constructive function of resistance in analysis. Ultimately, you do not have analysis without resistance against analysis. And also the big gamble of psychoanalysis has always been, will it survive resistance against it? Cultural, the analysance resistance, the resistance of science, the resistance of religion, the resistance of cultural morality, and so on and so forth. And also the resistance that comes with its success, when everyone thinks that they have their Freud in the small finger, and then forget about the problems that Freud is constantly struggling with.
I like this notion that resistance is something to be worked with and worked through. And it's similar to how I was kind of bringing up earlier when I was paraphrasing your idea that for Marx and Freud, alienation too, our shared negativity, so to speak, is something not just to be overcome or abolished once and for all, but it's something that is sort of constitutive of our subjectivity, and so it's something to be worked with and worked through, not necessarily just phantasmatically dissipated with any one end of history, if you will, where we're all sort of liberated after the advent of communism or something, as though there was some eschatological moment, but that there is this continual tarrying with that shared negativity.
I think, again, solidarity is the name for affirming this shared, or affirming negativity as shared and not as other people's problem. It doesn't mean really being solidary with an emancipatory movement that clearly has nothing to do with my identity. I don't know. Doesn't mean, or doesn't have to mean, appropriating this movement. I mean, okay, liberalism has expressed quite a lot of fake solidarity with various emancipatory movements. We can think of, LGBTQ plus movement or Black Lives Matter or, anti-colonial struggles. But if honest liberals would really solidarize with these movements, they would have to ultimately abolish themselves as liberals. Mm-hmm. They would have to affirm a knot of political universals and not just freedom from which we actually have to get freed, if you ask me, because what liberalism, and then of course economic liberalism, so political and economic liberalism, pursue as a social ideal is actually a very antisocial idea of freedom from constraints. And then everyone wonders why phenomena like Trump pop up eventually. It's the most consequent liberal. It's just like, holding the mirror, what the liberal drive is in the end. Freedom of speech is verbal diarrhea. Freedom of the market is, social devastation. The good social egoism of Homo economicus is a raging subject of entitlement, and so on and so forth.
what I was starting with my half-baked idea was that somehow maybe like resistance was at the level of the subject and repression was at the level of the symbolic or the social, and they were these sort of forces that were holding the subject on its path around the object or something like that. But I don't know if that quite works. Nevertheless, though, it does, I think, maybe point to a little bit further your discussion of like the drive as a sort of hinge point between the individual and the social, the animal and the divine per se. I don't know. I thought that was an interesting way to describe the drive as kind of this, I don't know, it's almost like this liminal thing. I don't know if you want to maybe discuss or want to draw that out a little bit further about how the drive sort of, I guess, is, I don't know if it's sort of a way to deal with this sort of gap or if it's, maybe something else.
There's one thing that I always found very interesting in Freud's concept of the drive. And again, I think one doesn't need Lacan to make Freud interesting because his formulations are really sometimes so spot on. He described his concept of the drive as a limit notion, Grenzbegriff. I think we can play with this formulation and say that it's a limit notion because it is a notion of a limit, or rather a notion of not limit, border. It's actually Grenze is border. Limit would be Schranke. Sorry for a little bit of German jargonism. It's important because a border creates a difference between two territories, and at the same time, it functions as a line of connection. So it's both a phenomenon of continuity and a phenomenon of cut. And what, according to Freud, the drive connects and differentiates is the psychic and the somatic, body and mind. A border can also be something, that doesn't have to have an outside. This is where Lacanian topology comes in. It can be a loop. It can be a loop in matter or a loop in the body itself that sort of creates something like a phantom double of the material body, which is not separated from this material body, which is not some sort of immaterial mental substance or whatever.
A body without organs is what I imagine. Not to distract us too much, sorry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the body without organs. I mean, we can call it a mythical body. We can call it an idea of the body, but it's still a body. It's indistinguishable from the stupid materiality of the body that is here and now, organic. To get back to the drive as a border, the drive is a force. So it's a border that is active, that stands for a specific activity that is ongoing in the living biological that we are. I guess Lacan then made this step that some don't agree with or may not agree with. The privileged name of this activity is language, a material activity that nevertheless generates complications in matter or complications in the organic. But of course, this doesn't mean that without language, the organic would be without complications. That's why I kind of like, also philosophers like Catherine Malabou who have a very speculative take on contemporary biological research and show that ultimately, we also have a very peculiar afterlife of structural thought here, or if we want to see, here in this field, a specific notion of or specific understanding of unstable and processual structures, something that Deleuze, also tried to think with his notion of becoming. I mean, it's a processual structure in the end. But that's what interests me in the concept of the drive, that it kind of stands for a specific complication in the materiality of the body, as far as this body is speaking, of course.
And I will say that it's interesting that you show the continuity or the resonance, the homology, to use your term, between some of Freud's language about the drive, whether it be its destiny, its working, its demand for work, insofar as it exerts pressure, and force, but also Marx's uses of the notions of drive. I really thought that was very insightful the way that you bring to the fore something that might get lost in a little bit in translation when we're reading. When I say we who
The
are
editorial
not,
we, right?
Yeah, the editorial we who are not necessarily reading Marx and Freud in German. So even if we may know a little bit about Strachey's translation of Trieb as instinct with its problematic history, we may be a little bit less aware of Marx's different uses of the notion of drive. For example, like the drive to accumulate is one of them. And you kind of work through that homology, and that helps to further your argument that really Marx and Freud are both themselves working through on a shared, let's say, pragmatic terrain.
Funnily enough, at least the New Left books, or later to be Verso, and the Penguin edition of Marx's Capital actually have Trieb translated as drive. So Marxists are way more precise in translation than the Freudians.
Right.
These translations of Freud's writings into English have been made under Freud's supervision. So the fact that he tolerated instinct, either he didn't know English well enough to know the word drive, or there is this kind of curious expression of his tendencies towards biology
and towards Latin and Greek, which gives it an air of scientificity.
Yeah. At the same time, he could have used instinct if he would have wanted to, but in his writing on drives and their destinies, he's basically using the same word Trieb to describe instinct, what we would call normally instinct, as a physiological, biologically conditioned force, and his notion of Trieb. But I mean, he's playing with words, he
is,
because he basically says our drive is much more peculiar or in the sexual field, the drive is much more peculiar because it's a constant force. It doesn't find temporary satisfaction. It's not cyclical, comes and goes. I'm not hungry all the time, but I do satisfy my oral drive all the time. That's one kind of very peculiar moment in Freud where he, kind of dismisses this biological associations of Trieb, which are there. And I mean, Trieb comes from botanics.
Yeah, okay.
Initially, it's in German, Trieb is also like a part of the young part of the plant,
Interesting.
Like a sapling or something?
The offshoot?
Yeah, the offshoot. Exactly, the offshoot. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I do think that Freud is very clear when he uses the German word instinct. It's more about this kind of pre-programmed, if you will, sort of almost, I'm trying to think of the way I would put it. The way he's thinking.
Firmware maybe on
it's kind of like a pre-programming, whereas the drive is not pre-programmed. It's constitutively deviated from any sort of programming, if you will.
And exactly.
That's due to our helplessness, right? That's due to we're born prematurely, both biologically and linguistically, symbolically. It's those two helplessnesses that kind of condemn us to what Lacan might call castration, or Freud might think about in terms of what the way in which the sexual drive leans on the self-preservative drive, and that contamination, that leaning on, if you will, is sort of, it prepares us for, these different forms of alienation, but also the foundations for exploitation, as you point out, which I thought was really good. You're hitting home the biological and symbolic sort of precociousness of our births prime us for various forms of exploitation. You want to say maybe a word about that?
There's this interesting acknowledgement of this kind of ontological lack when it comes to the human subject. In Adam Smith, that's something that very, very much surprised me when I started reading Smith's work, because I was kind of expecting to just get the confirmations of everything that neoliberals have made out of Smith, these kind of small tokens that become a kind of common knowledge, but actually it's not common knowledge, it's just common error. And it's not this greed is not primary, or egoism is not primary. what is primary is precisely this born infants, born
Right.
helpless, born in a state of immaturity and absolute dependency. And then, one could also say this is some sort of, constitutive alienation of the human subject. It doesn't cease throughout the life. We are a relation. Yeah, we are the exact opposite of what vulgar egotistic worldview is claiming. And I think this is also the ultimate signification of Aristotle's definition of human being as a political animal is. This animal is ultimately a relational animal, or just a relation, no substance.
I think maybe the last thing I'd like to hit upon is a little bit this idea of sublimation as a satisfaction without repression. And then I grabbed the footnote from the text. I don't know if we might read through that, or I don't know if you have any comments on this. I think it'd be also interesting, maybe, I don't know if we have time to talk a little bit about just sublimation broadly and maybe different conceptions between Freud, Lacan, etc., because I think that'll play into it.
If I can add, Coop, you and I have talked about it a little bit, and maybe Samo has an opinion on this, or if not, we can talk more about the quote you've grabbed here, and specifically this notion of sublimation as satisfaction without repression. But with Deleuze and Guattari, their main pushback against this notion of sublimation is, we find in Freud variously, sort of this idea that the libido has to be desexualized in order to invest the social. And I'm wondering if that formulation in Freud doesn't undergo a change in Lacan, where there's a kind of a different conceptualization of sublimation that isn't necessarily about what happens to the libido in its investment in, Freud's typical ideas are desublimation is how civilization, art, things that aren't directly invested in the satisfactions of need, but have these higher quote unquote goals, have to be desexualized in a certain way, whereas Deleuze and Guattari are like, no, sexuality is everywhere. The libido isn't desexualized in investing.
No, but that's not Freud's point at all. I mean, if you read, for instance, Freud's criticism of worldviews, in his new introductory lectures, he's saying so blunt. I mean, it's almost too vulgar. It's almost too direct sexuality. Our desire, religion is basically a sublimated version of our desire for paternal love, or it's, you basically blush, you want it to be more sophisticated. How about for some sadistic authority, to bring some spice in, or joke aside, what I want to say is basically he detects desire at the center of worldview mechanisms and conceptions of the world, and reads them as dreams. Well, he doesn't put it so explicitly out in the open, but if you have read the interpretation of dreams and the function of desire in his conception of dream as fulfillment, as a satisfaction, hallucinatory satisfaction of an actually existing desire, then you basically see this all over his critique of worldview mechanisms. And that's why he basically says that psychoanalysis shouldn't construct a worldview, because its function is not to satisfy desire, its function is to transform it. And this definition of sublimation that Lacan makes as satisfaction without repression means precisely that it's targeting metamorphosis, overall metamorphosis in the mechanism of satisfaction. This metamorphosis is changing desire, changing the workings of desire and the consequences that it has on my psychosomatic nexus and the organization of life, of everyday life, the way I function in the world, to put it banal. And I very much like this remark that Lacan makes, that it's a shift from the changing of object to the change of the object in itself. I hope that you don't find it too misplaced to read this change of object in itself, not simply as, this metonymic issue, because that's changing objects. But the change of object in itself means precisely change as object. But again, it doesn't bring us that far, because there are changes and changes. To repeat myself, change as object. We find this in capitalism all over. But it's this quantitative change or increase in value or economic growth, whatever. This is all change as object. But the way capitalism, flattens it into its notion of profit. Whereas, this other part of change would be social change as a social effect, or a social object. Whereas, again, this issue of antisociality has been I've been obsessing about it in the past couple of years. So, this economic notion of change, qua change in value or increase of value, is an anti-social notion of change.
Right.
And we can have then, again, sorry for repeating myself, all these everyday changes and bigger or smaller revolutions in our technology, knowledge, and so on and so forth, which are ultimately no changes at all, because they do not change anything
about the system.
On the level of the framework.
Would it be a distinction between like imaginary and real here, or am I
like change the
imaginary? We can go back again to Freud's critique of worldviews. The worldviews in the end are providing some sort of imaginary fixation or imaginary stabilization and predictability of reality. Lacan would say they make functioning reality out of a dysfunctional real.
They fill in the gaps and the negativities.
Yeah, they fill in the gaps.
Like you talk about with myths. Myths are these ways of filling in these gaps. They're both too much and too little.
Even I think continuity editing in film, like you don't really notice the cuts, right? Because you're habituated and you've learned to the cuts are not legible to you because you're sort of habituated in it. But anyways.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a similar way to it smooths over things. So it appears as this nice, beautiful sphere, but if you really investigate it, it's kind of this motley beast.
Yeah.
And so making change to make change into the libidinally invested object is also to turn to D&G, I like how Guattari is always thinking about these transitory formations or these transitory subject groups that don't necessarily try to erect themselves as in a totalitarian way as though to immortalize themselves. Because there's something about what you're describing when capitalism brings about change and merely quantitative change. It's also erecting itself as the immobile motor, capital as the immortality of the system. And so in that sense, change has not reached, as you said, the level of the framework of the systemic level wherein capital itself would be threatened with change or with transitoriness, with these injections of death drive, as they put it, where it's I think this is part of what maybe the kernel of truth and accelerationism, if it has one, is about, is sort of speak pushing capital or capitalism to the point where it takes on the speed of light, inertia, whatever, to affect its own change. But then again, that might be sometimes, with your critique of accelerationism earlier in the book or elsewhere, you can just imagine that there might be something else to work through, or this different way of working through than merely about acceleration. And I think that,
I think it works for me as a metaphorical language.
Okay.
But that's also why I'm highly skeptical, towards accelerationism, which in the end, I think we kind of overblew it as a real issue. I only take it seriously when seriously, like something that I seriously need to engage with when my students, because it's very popular in art schools. Or maybe it's no longer the case. I haven't any accelerationists in a while now, but it definitely was popular for a while. in cultural studies and art context. That's why I need to engage with it critically. But again, I think it's a kind of a very graspable, maybe even likable metaphor. But I think it overlooks two things. One is capitalism has always been also kind of self-regulatory, but not in the manner, vulgar economists are talking about. Oh yeah, the market will take care of everything.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
No, but there have always been emergency breaks, to make sure that exploitation remains tolerable, that it's not too obvious, or that it's not too painful, that it's not causing too much outrage. The function of social democracy and of liberalism. That's why these two are the political options that I dislike the most. Because they're traitors. Because they participate precisely in this self-regulatory,
right,
this self-corrective feature. Like, we are still not correcting anything, just to make sure that I'm not advocating liberal and neoliberal superstitions about some self-corrective markets and so on. But again, to kind of keep exploitation somewhere where it's still profitable, but not too obviously harming. And we're talking about the White West here, because for everyone else, there is no correction. We can just kill them. This has been the stance of capitalism all along. That's one thing that I think talks against accelerationism. The other one is that this is a system of organized anti-sociality. And in the end, this means that systemic resistance can manifest also in a way in which it takes all of us hostage and is pushing us into a global catastrophe, like an environmental breakdown. An environmental breakdown here means the catastrophic change of the extra-cultural conditions of possibility of culture, the environmental conditions which favor something like civilization. So the other aspect is a bit in contradiction with the first one, the self, like keeping exploitation at a handbrake. The other one is overt amok, a system that runs amok. And I think this is the other side of capitalism, which we are seeing emerge in recent years more and more. So I'm a skeptic when it comes to green capitalism.
Right.
It's kind of, this could be one self-corrective, in quotation mark, aspect. But I think this kind of sinister and even dystopian vision of capitalism is also proved to be found in Marx's Capital volumes.
Right.
Already, if we take the idea of capital as drive seriously and read it together with Freud, we basically get this potential global catastrophic scenario.
The way that the phrase that kept coming up in my head, thinking about your work that kept circulating, was you talk about the parasitism of virtual infinity on finitude. And you're talking about the drive for surplus value, surplus enjoyment, the excessive nature of the drive, whereby capitalism becomes a culture of a death drive, whereby, like a parasite, it very much threatens any conditions of possibility and sustainability that would allow it to live on, right? Which is why you bring up ecological catastrophe, and which is kind of where obviously we're headed for. Not to be too bleak, listeners, but that's...
But in this entire history of attempts to naturalize capitalism, like Marx has been mocking, the bourgeois economists, that they see the institutions of capitalism as, the most in sync with human nature and so on and so forth. The most dangerous one is precisely contemporary environmental crisis, because, it's not that capitalism is something natural. Of course, it's not. But if it brings about the breakdown, the dismantling of, again, extra-cultural environmental conditions of culture, it fully actualizes itself as an environmental catastrophe. It basically becomes indistinguishable from an environmental catastrophe, that it, of course, generated itself as its ultimate surplus product.
That's good.
That's good. That's very good. Wow.
I will say, Coop, you can. I definitely don't want to cut you off. Last words, but if we do want to, if you want to have a thought, and then maybe Samo can sort of tell us what he's working on, working through at the moment and for the future. But I want to give you a chance, Coop.
Please, Samo, go ahead and let us know what you're working on future wise, and I don't want to open up another can of worms because I know you're looking to go.
Right now, I'm more focusing on teaching. Yeah, giving on the one hand, like classes that are kind of engaging with the ongoing actuality of psychoanalysis for, well, not only political theory, also for aesthetic discussions in the present. And otherwise, I mean, like I said, I'm a little bit obsessed with this topic of antisociality, or a capitalist antisociality, capitalism as an antisocial system. So perhaps I'll kind of try to organize my thoughts in another booklet, but I'm not sure about that yet. I did produce some articles in the past 2 years that go into this direction, but where the ship goes, time will
Nobody
show.
knows, right?
Or it will sink somewhere on the way.
I think it's great. I know that we merely scratched the surface, but I did like that we were able to delve into resistance, working through the drive, and maybe we left off on a pessimistic note, but I mean, I do think that there are, if we kind of think back to one of the refrains today, which I feel is in your book, if not in the term you spoke of, but you're speaking of solidarity in terms of, for example, shared negativity is one of the ways you put it. I think that's part of the bright side. We'll leave the listeners with just to think about how that shared negativity is also that sharing, as you said, the relationality of our constitutive helplessness. And so we have to think about how that can be paradoxically empowering, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we know from Lacan specifically that if we say that we have nothing in common, this can also mean to have in common quite a lot, speaking about castration, negativity, and
yes.
And so on and so forth. I mean, this nothing has an organizing function in psychoanalysis or in psychoanalytic conception of subjectivity, and that's, I guess, what I'm after, talking about shared negativity.
Mm-hmm.
Negativity connects.
Yes. I mean, I like it. It's, I'm thinking, again, as Coop said, not to open a can of words, I was thinking of your elaboration of working through in these different contexts and how that's kind of shared with Marx and Freud. Even if it's a specific concept in Freud, you see it in Marx in terms of social transformations as well. I'm thinking of working through in terms of the desiring machines. They break down, but they break through. So they're
dysfunctional.
Food for thought.
They're dysfunctional, and that's also what I found always interesting in Deleuze and Guattari's misreading of Freud. I guess because basically what they claim to be claiming themselves is actually very Freudian.
Yes, it is.
It's also quite clear that they're not talking about some authentic Freud, but more about what Freud has become in various cultural contexts and how it has been used and misused for very anti-Freudian purposes.
Yeah.
The machine has always had for me this meaning of discourse or structure. But so when I read Anti-Oedipus, it was really about this is kind of structuralism that places much more accent on the instability rather than this kind of permutational machinic, where also we can hear something machinic in terms of automatism, or functional automatism, perpetuum mobile or whatever, also in classical structuralism. But again, I think this sort of vulgarized version or vulgar stereotype of structuralism that never existed. They were all kind of, talking about dysfunctioning and unstable orders.
It's funny because I think your discussion of death drive was making me think about desiring production, just because the demand for work, the demand to produce desire, I don't know, that's kind of brought it in with sharper relief for me, I guess.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
The demand to enjoy.
Whatever that's worth.
Right. So
the constant demand for work.
Yeah, but this is again something that Freud says himself. The drive is a demand, can be broken down to a demand for work.
Yes.
I mean, this is why I think that they're so...
all the mental and physical efforts in some pointless satisfaction. It's it really hits the core of what is the success story of capitalism, to make everything useless.
It gives us a lot of food for thought to keep working through, and and so Samo, we really appreciate your time spending with us, and talking about your book, talking about your work, talking about sort of the broader context of Marx and Freud. It's obviously something that I think it's very serendipitous, as we said, that it coincides with a lot of the investigations we've been doing. And so furthering our interest too, I already thank you for that, but then giving us your time to sort of keep us on this journey of transforming our ways of thinking and being and feeling, et cetera. Right. I don't want to wrap this all in a bow, but I really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you so much. It was really, sincerely, great pleasure. And it was a great joy to be here in this context and talk to you guys.
We'll be in touch. I think, Coop, do you think this episode will be released next week? So
should be out next week, yeah.
So next weekend, we'll be in touch. We'll let you know when the episode airs, so you can force all of your friends and students to listen to it. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. We're going to stay around just for a moment, just to talk shop. But I can't thank you enough for being here today.
And likewise.
Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Samo. And that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.